Sometimes the weirdest games from the early Game Boy era end up becoming the most memorable. Not because they were polished, not because they sold millions of copies, but because they had one bizarre idea that nobody else even attempted. Today we're talking about one of the strangest little puzzle platformers that most Nintendo fans have completely forgotten. David Crane's The Rescue of Princess Blobette. This is the sequel to A Boy and His Blob, a game already famous for being confusing, cryptic, and weirdly ambitious for the NES. But somehow the Game Boy sequel squeezes all of those ideas into a tiny, monochrome handheld screen. And the result is either a hidden gem or a complete disaster, depending on who you ask. You play as a nameless boy trying to rescue Princess Blobette alongside your jellybean-eating alien blob friend. And yes, the whole game revolved around feeding jellybeans to a blob in order to transform him into useful tools. Need a ladder? Jellybean. Need a trampoline? Jellybean. Need therapy after falling off of a platform over 50 times? Unfortunately, there is no Jellybean for that. Why? Today I want to take a deep dive into what makes this game so fascinating. We'll talk about the history behind it, gameplay mechanics, difficulty and atmosphere, and whether or not this Game Boy cult classic actually deserves more love, or if nostalgia is doing all the heavy lifting. So grab your sack of jelly beans because we're headed back to Blobonia. Before we even talk about the game itself, we need to talk about David Crane. David Crane is one of the biggest names from the early era of gaming. He worked at Activision and helped create some incredibly influential games during the Atari era. Pitfall alone basically made him a gaming legend. So when you hear the name David Crane attached to a Game Boy puzzle platformer about feeding an alien blob jelly beans, you immediately know this is going to be interesting. The original Boy and His Blob released on the NES in 1989 and became famous for its creativity. The entire concept revolved around solving environmental puzzles and using the blob to transform into different useful tools. But the game was also infamous for being confusing. It barely explained anything. You had to memorize the different jellybean transformations either through trial and error or by reading the manual. And if you didn't understand the logic of the game, it felt impossible. Still, many admired the creativity behind it. He opened his mouth. That was so close. Oh my god. Then came the rescue of Princess Blobette for the Game Boy in 1990 and 1991, depending on region. The game was developed by Imagineering and published by Absolute Entertainment. It was designed and programmed by David Crane himself. Rather than trying to reinvent the original formula, the game doubles down on the puzzle mechanics. Everything takes place in a giant castle on Blobonia, where Princess Blobette has been kidnapped by an evil alchemist. Simple setup, tiny scale, huge frustration. And honestly, that simplicity works in the game's favor. So how does this game actually work? You control the boy directly, and the blob follows automatically behind you. The boy cannot jump. That's the first thing you need to understand. He can run left and right, and that's basically it. Every obstacle in the game is solved by transforming the blob into a different tool. And that's where the jelly beans come in. Each kind of jelly bean triggers a different transformation. And then let's make you a key. Tangerine becomes a trampoline. Apple becomes a jack. Really, bro? For no reason. You just didn't want to eat the first one. Licorice becomes a ladder. Lime becomes a key. The system is honestly genius. Even today, the idea feels creative. It turns inventory management into problem solving. You're constantly asking, what tool do I need here? What transformation makes sense? How do I get across this room without killing myself? And the coolest thing is the transformations feel tactile. Blob doesn't just magically cast abilities, he physically transforms into objects. And that idea still has a lot of charm decades later. But here's the problem. The game explains almost nothing. Modern players will probably bounce off it immediately because it requires experimentation, memorization, and patience at a level that modern games just don't demand anymore. And honestly, I kind of respect that. No! This feels like a game from an era where developers assumed that players would spend weeks slowly figuring things out. There are no objective markers, no hints, no pop-up tutorials. Just you, your blob, and maximum confusion. Oh my god, he pushed me when he transformed. That was lame. Now, unfortunately, this is where things start getting rough. The controls are not great. And depending on your tolerance for retro games, they can actually drive you insane. The boy moves stiffly. The jumping substitutes feel awkward. The blob AI can be frustrating. And because the game revolves around precise puzzle solving, bad movement feels especially punishing. Oh, Lord have mercy. One of the biggest issues is momentum. You never feel completely in control, especially in dangerous sections with moving platforms. And remember, you can't jump naturally. So every movement puzzle is entirely dependent on blob transformations working exactly as intended. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they absolutely do not. There are moments where Blob accidentally pushes you into danger, and moments where your timing feels completely off. And because this is an early 90s Game Boy game, dying often means playing sections repeatedly. Now, to be fair, certain retro fans absolutely love this. There's a certain brutal trial and error design philosophy that creates tension. So when you finally solve a room correctly, it feels genuinely satisfying. But for casual players, this game will absolutely test your patience. Oh, it was close. One thing I genuinely appreciate about Princess Blobette is the castle design. The game world feels interconnected in a surprisingly ambitious way for the Game Boy. Instead of isolated arcade-style levels, the castle feels like one giant puzzle box. And because each room is based around solving a specific problem, progression feels mentally rewarding. There's also a weird loneliness to the environment I really like. The Game Boy hardware gives everything a stark monochrome atmosphere. Empty corridors, silent rooms, strange machinery. Everything has a really eerie vibe. It doesn't feel like a happy Nintendo platformer. It feels isolated, cold, almost dreamlike. And honestly, I think the Game Boy limitations almost help to improve the mood. Okay, we need to talk about the difficulty. This game is hard. Not Souls-like hard, not Reflex hard, but cryptic hard. The kind of hard where you stare at a room for 15 minutes wondering what the game wants from you. And depending on your personality, that's either incredibly rewarding or deeply annoying. Some puzzles feel brilliant because the solution instantly clicks, and others feel like guesswork. The game constantly leaves you wondering, how was I supposed to know that? I have no idea where I'm supposed to go. A lot of older games relied on manuals, Nintendo Power, playground conversations, or sheer persistence. That old school design philosophy is fascinating historically, but it absolutely creates barriers for modern audiences. Visually, this game is incredibly simple. The environments are minimal, and there's very little detail. But I really think this art style actually works. The blob animations are charming, and the transformations are easy to recognize. This is one of those early Game Boy games where simplicity is an advantage. Now, if you compare it to later Game Boy masterpieces like Link's Awakening or Donkey Kong 94, it obviously looks primitive. But within the context of 1990 handheld gaming, it's solid. The sound design is also very basic. Short loops, simple effects, minimal atmosphere, but weirdly enough, the sparse audio contributes to the lonely feeling of the castle. Oh, there we go. But it's gonna kill me. So how does the sequel compare to the original NES game? Honestly, it depends entirely on what you value. The original A Boy and His Blob had bigger ambition. It felt larger scale, more experimental, and more open-ended. But the rescue of Princess Blobette feels tighter, more focused, more streamlined, less chaotic. The Game Boy limitations forced the developers to simplify the formula, which actually makes the experience way more cohesive. At the same time, some players still miss the sense of wonder from the NES game. The original felt like a strange interplanetary adventure, while the sequel was one giant dungeon crawl. Personally, I think the sequel is easier to revisit today because it's much more structured. Still brutally difficult, still confusing, but more digestible. One reason this game still gets talked about decades later is because it feels almost unlike anything else. There are plenty of puzzle platformers and plenty of retro Game Boy games, but no other game has an identity quite like this. The Jellybean mechanic alone makes it memorable. And despite the frustrations, people who grew up with this game often remember it vividly. That's the hallmark of a cult classic. Not necessarily universal praise, but strong emotional memory. Some people absolutely love this game, while others hated it. And both reactions make sense. Retro communities to this day still debate whether it's underrated or just painfully outdated. So is David Crane's The Rescue of Princess Blobette actually worth playing today? If you love retro puzzle games, weird Game Boy experiments, and old school design, absolutely. If you're interested in gaming history, definitely. But if you're not a fan of cryptic gameplay, frustrating controls, and trial and error puzzle solving, you're probably going to hate this. And somehow, feeding your alien blob different flavored jelly beans became one of the most defining concepts of an era. Princess Blobette isn't perfect. It's flawed. Very flawed. But it's also imaginative, creative, and unforgettable. And that's way more important to me than perfection. Thanks for watching, everybody. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into weird retro games, make sure you subscribe and let me know which forgotten Game Boy title I should cover next. And I want to know, did you grow up with a boy and his blob? Or would this game totally break your patience today? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, keep your jelly beans close. Up next, don't miss the 30th anniversary edition of The Seventh Guest.